Okay, thanks for those who joined us. We're going to get started probably in about another 30 seconds. Okay, thanks for joining us. Ann, are you ready to go, Ann?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, delighted that you've joined us here today, and delighted those of us who are online there have joined us today for our, I guess, fifth in the spring AEDE webinars. And we're delighted that Ann Fitzpatrick has joined us today. Ann you've been here for about, what, 2 years now at Ohio
Mm-hmm.
State?
Yep.
Okay. Ann joined our department, what, 2 years ago as a development economist. And I just found out because I looked at her CV now, got an undergraduate degree from my favorite university, Cornell University, and then got a PhD from my least favorite university, the University of Michigan. That's okay. We won't hold that against you. We're really glad that you then went to the University of Massachusetts and then came here to Ohio State. We're really glad to have you here at Ohio State. Ann's a development economist and does a ton of work with folks in different parts of the world trying to understand sort of economic conditions and how I think, as I understand from your work, how we can design policies to help hopefully improve the livelihoods of people really all over the world and people who are obviously, well, not obviously, but in much more dire circumstances than those of us here in the United States. So, Anne, we're delighted you're here with us. I'm going to turn it over to you. Feel free to make additional introductions, but the topic that Anne's going to discuss with us today is affordability, accessibility, and daycare quality evidence from Kenya. Thanks, Anne.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brent. I do want to highlight, though, that I am from Dayton, Ohio. And so I consider myself a lifelong Buckeye, actually. So, what I'm here to talk about today is childcare. Why does it matter? One reason why it matters is there's a very close link between childcare and income generation, particularly for people with young children. And what I'm going to also highlight today is document the status quo of the paid childcare landscape in urban informal settlements, informed by recent research that I have been doing in Kenya. I want to also highlight that this work is team-based, and my co-authors include Emily Beam, Vinca Deante, Eric Ochiang, Myra Romeo, and also co-authors on previous work, Selene Delacour, Anya Marchenko, and Lena Lowe. And I want to also gratefully acknowledge all of the funders that have contributed to this effort, including the JPAL, Gender and Economic Agency Initiative, the Livelihood Impact Fund, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the IZA Women in Work Initiative. So why is it important to focus on childcare? So children are the focus of sort of everything that we're thinking about here. The first 5 years of life, and particularly the first 1,000 days of life, are thought to be a very critical period for both cognitive and socio-emotional development. But also, childcare comes at a time when parents are heavily responsible for their children, and increasing parental labor force participation is important, especially for mothers. Um, there's also a strong policy interest in that childcare can affect whole communities. And Nobel laureate James Heckman has a very large body of work on the importance of early childhood interventions. So, what I would like to demonstrate, sort of a broad overview of the research that informs why this is important. So, there's a very large literature, highly rigorous randomized evaluations that show that there's a large number of benefits of paid childcare for children. So the Abecedarian Project worked with low-income children in North Carolina, the Perry Preschool Project, Head Start evaluations. They have all found that the introduction of high-quality preschool leads to substantial cognitive effects ranging from zero point 0.7 to 1.45 standard deviations. That is an enormous effect. For example, to put it in context for somebody not familiar with standard deviations, 0.1 is the typical benchmark of what a successful evaluation is. These are about 7 to 10 times the effect of what we consider effective education evaluations. Why is it so effective? It actually raises IQ, and those effects generally persist, although there has been noted to be some fade out. And this is not just work that's done in high quality preschools in the US. A recent, actually ongoing evaluation in Tarakaniti in Kenya found that overall child development increased by 0.28 standard deviations, with IQ increases about 0.36 standard deviations. Heckman especially has done a large body of work following up on the Perry Preschool Project, especially showing that these positive impacts relate into adulthood. So one thing that's been noted is that the brain is forming and is very malleable at these young ages. And what Heckman postulates is that there's actually personality and socio-emotional soft skill formation that is extremely valuable as people age and in the labor market. So his work finds, for example, improvement in employment, the lower propensity to commit crimes, higher likelihood of voting, the higher likelihood of owning a bank account, many other outcomes that one would not necessarily directly tie to preschool. The rate of return is thought to be around 12% from that. But more recent work has found that these effects are not a given. And there's two key reasons why we would expect slightly different effects on children of preschool. The first is that gains are only realized if the paid care that parents are using is high quality. And there's a pretty well-known study that used the universal expansion of childcare in Quebec to demonstrate that childcare may be harmful and can affect the parent-child relationship if it is not high quality. And we can talk about what high quality means if people are interested. But also more recent work has found smaller effects of preschool, partly because it does affect, the effects of preschool depend upon what we would call the outside option, what parents are doing in the absence of sending their children to preschool. For example, if you think about high income children whose parents may, for example, be using or relying upon a nanny instead of paid childcare, or a very engaged parent, that may have different effects than a children who is left alone or watching TV. But parents also benefit from childcare, and this is what's really interesting about interventions of childcare. There has been a pretty robust findings of positive impacts for parents. So recently completed work in the US on universal full day kindergarten finds that increases earnings by about 21% of parents, mostly because it allows parents to work more regular types of jobs and longer hours. What that study finds is that each additional dollar spent from a public preschool program yields about $10 in benefits, mostly through higher tax revenues, because the effects of employment increases, particularly for moms, persist for about 6 years. But that's not just been found in the US. In India, there was a study about what happened when employers provided childcare at work. They found that mothers similarly worked more hours and had lower absenteeism. In rural DRC, with the creation of community-based preschools, they found that agricultural earnings increased by about 30%. Similarly, Uganda and Kenya providing subsidies to use daycare increased parental earnings for both mothers and fathers by various amounts. Clark, which is a very similar context to what we're working in, found earnings increased by 8%, partly because it allowed mothers to work further away, and they also switched the types of occupations that they engaged in. There can also be non-financial benefits. So a study in Burkina Faso finds small reductions in depression when mothers use childcare. So despite how beneficial this may be, many parents worldwide lack access to affordable, high quality childcare. The estimate from 2021 is that there's about 350 million young children need but lack childcare. And this is typically not because parents are reluctant to use childcare. In fact, many studies have found women typically report a desire for additional support. And in the absence of affordable, high quality childcare, there's as many as 35 million children that are left alone weekly. So this would be alarming from a safety standpoint, as young children may not have the wherewithal to avoid dangerous situations. They may also not be able to do anything educational or anything productive during that time. And also, this is also an interesting market because on the paid childcare side, providers often make very low margins, and this has been noted as a challenge worldwide. As specifically in the US, the number of paid childcare providers has been decreasing steadily due to rising costs and the lack of general public financing. So what does childcare look like in Kenya? Well, let's travel to Kenya and think about what childcare and specifically paid childcare looks there. So Kenya's population about 52 million people. The national poverty rate is about 40%. In general, the population is a mix of urban and rural areas, and it's quickly urbanizing. And when we think about poverty, it's kind of important to think through, what does poverty look like? And when you think of poverty, sort of what comes to mind? So poverty can be thought of as a multidimensional concept. Poverty can be housing poverty, it can be lack of education. It could have a gender component, such as lack of empowerment. It could be purely income-based, and there's also a recent concept of time poverty, where people just don't have enough time to themselves. Officially, the benchmark is 215 per day for what's called extreme poverty. That's 215 in sort of local currency purchasing power parity terms. And you can think of how that would look like for your own life. So some examples of what a typical impoverished setting would consist of is, for example, there would be no shoes. Other basic amenities that many people would sort of use regularly, like towels, are also not commonly found. People, use cloth, but not towels in the Western sense. And everything that one would use is generally homemade or used. There's not a whole bunch of new purchases. It also would manifest as public services and infrastructure. So, for example, toilets would generally be outhouses or some worse settings. There's a lack of public toilets worldwide. Poverty also typically has no electricity or plumbing, and basic government services like garbage pickup are not provided or privately provided, and so therefore relatively expensive for the population. And what's I'm kind of setting the stage for is how that would manifest for childcare is also, even for adults, there wouldn't be a lot of books. There wouldn't be a TV or general entertainment. Entertainment would look a little different. It would be, for example, a whole bunch of people crowding around listening to a radio together. But most people actually worldwide do have phones. And the other thing to think about when you think about poverty is the 215 a day is typically not constant. It's not like every day you have $2 to live on. What one really great book, this is actually a book that is almost more of a pop culture book that is pretty easily accessible, is Portfolios of the Poor, which highlight that to live on $2 a day typically requires a lot of juggling and constant borrowing and savings. So people typically have varying accounts with different friends and family, or more recently, microfinance providers. And so there's a lot actually of very sophisticated financial maneuvers that one must do because typically environments with high poverty rates also typically don't have regular streams of income. And agriculture is probably the best example. If you are a farmer, you typically only have income when you sell your harvest, which is not year round. So one thing that's kind of interesting, and unfortunately this didn't uh, uh, come up, but extreme poverty has declined worldwide. So poverty is concentrated geographically, though, nowadays in certain contexts. And in the particular context, as one highlights on the screen, is sub-Saharan Africa in particular is one region of the world that still struggles with a high rate of poverty. And Kenya would be that country right there that has actually is not one of the poorest countries of the world, but still has a relatively high rate of poverty. So rural poverty may look somehow more familiar. Rural poverty, for example, may have houses with huts, materials and walls. Rural poverty that may be a bit more impoverished, which, for example, have dung for walls, and again, everything is homemade. The roof is something that people would make together. Urban poverty is going to look a little different, and urbanization is rapidly increasing worldwide as people leave villages for higher earnings. So, without affordable housing, what tends to happen is people who move to the cities don't have the ability to pay for established existing homes, and so they create informal settlements sort of on the edge of cities, which leads to sort of sprawl. And in Kenya in particular, about half of the urban population lives in informal settlements, which is actually a lot larger than the global average of about 24% of urban people. And this is kind of what this would generally look like, and that's a trading center on the right. So in the context that we're studying in is Kibera, which is an example of an informal settlement. That's in Nairobi. It's actually the largest informal settlement in the world, has about 1 million people there. And I think if you visit there, one thing that you can that comes through is sort of how dense it is, but also how there's not tall buildings the way a central business district would have, and also the lack of government services. Individuals there typically don't have strong property rights, and that's consistent with sort of the absence of government and weak infrastructure, very, very uh, less developed road networks. There's very little planning. There's lots of animals nearby, living in close proximity to people, and there's similarly no social protections. So, in this context, and I would just want to check. So, in this context, we can think about what daycare and childcare looks like. So, in Kenya, nearly all women become mothers, and the average woman worldwide or countrywide, has 3.4 kids. In urban areas, it's a little lower, about 2.8 kids. But in general, many women need to earn income, but also raise a family. And women in general typically demand income as a means for economic empowerment and to have more decision-making power within the household. So there's a lot of strategies that women undertake to handle the needs to generate income, but also the needs to take care of their children. So informal kin arrangements are very common. Watching children themselves is also very common. And also paid childcare, which is what we're going to talk about a lot in this webinar. And I want to also highlight, though, that women are also doing other things. So, for example, a recent survey paper by Dinkelman and Guy find that on average, women in sub-Saharan Africa do on average about 25 hours of paid work and about 48 hours of household production, everything from cooking for several hours per day to fetching water to doing cleaning and other mending tasks for the family. So one thing that's been noted by me, is that many women bring their children to work with them. So in especially urban settings, small micro enterprises are the norm of how businesses and work are thought of. So only about 25% of women who work do regular wage labor. Labor markets are underdeveloped, and many women who would potentially even desire to work for an employer, there is no employer to work for. And if you need money, you need to sell and operate a business yourself. So this is a very common strategy for people to earn money. So what I'm showing you here is results from a recent paper about the gender profit gap. And what we find here is that basically businesses can locate at home, in a trading center, or in the market. What we find here is that basically for all types of businesses, there's heavy, substantial profit returns to operating in the market, which makes sense because that's where the customers are. On the other hand, working from home is generally bad for business. So why don't more people work from home? Or why don't more people operate their business from a market instead of operating their business from home? Well, part of the reason is that women must also shoulder the responsibility of childcare. And what happens is women often need to both take care of their children, but also run their business at the same time. And so, what is a very common strategy, if you want to earn more money and not multitask, is to instead leverage daycares that already exist. So, the daycare market in Kenya consists of preschool and paid childcare, which is also known as daycare. Daycares in Kenya generally receive less attention, and there's a very it's a market that's largely informal and generally unregulated. The prevailing norms are that children that are under 3 and not eligible to attend preschool are the responsibility of mothers, and there's also a prevailing view that child swapping is common. So what we do to really explore what does the market for paid childcare look like in Kenya is we first define 55 markets in urban informal settlements of 11 counties. And what we did is we selected areas to really study this market. In Kenya, a county is like a state. So this is not a truly national study, but it is a wide swath of the urban population in particular. We first just counted the number of facilities that were there that meet our criteria. We were careful to, for example, not count um, nannies as paid childcare providers because we were really looking at from a firm perspective. We then wanted to collect a detailed survey of what firm operations look like and how they are caring for children. So what we did is we then recruited firms into our study. We recruited a random sample of firms. If there were less than 20 in the community, we included all firms. If the community had more than 20, we did a random sample. We have in our data set nearly 1,000 daycares in urban informal settlements. But one thing that's really important is, again, the parent side and eventually, hopefully, the child side. So what we did is we recruited households with children that would possibly be exposed to a quality intervention within the mapped communities. We recruited households that were outside daycare centers and individuals who were just around the community. And we have data on the daycare habits and opinions and use and income of about 2,800 households, again, in this community. We also resurveyed the households and the firms earlier this year to do a quick check-in to reduce attrition for the main study. We also collected different amenities, and we have a pretty high response rate. So you're probably curious, what does the supply side of this market look like? The first is that contrary to some prevailing norms that child swapping is common and people don't really rely upon paid care, we find that actually in urban areas, there are very, very many daycares. What we find is that generally there are more than 10 options within a relatively small uh, polygon, as we say, a geographic contiguous area, and that there is a very vibrant supply. Moreover, we ask firms about capacity constraints. Firms generally don't report that they are capacity constrained, and they would be willing to take on even more children. So what we're finding first and foremost is that supply exists. The second is that when daycares exist, they are often located in schools. So if you look at the types of providers that are there, schools typically offer younger grades that are kind of more like babysitting services, and in addition to their regular uh, preschool and kindergarten and primary school classrooms. However, about a third of the daycare market is more informal um, uh, types of providers that are home-based. Okay. So if you look at how these different providers compare, on average, there's about 16 children served per daycare, and about 7 children served per daycare in non-school-based centers. Schools are generally much, much larger. One thing that we're kind of proud about is that this actually represents the experience of many children. Even though we have about 1,000, a little less than 1,000 providers, our data capture at least 13,000 children and what they are typically experiencing on a daily basis. Yeah. One other thing to note is that there's a the large difference in the composition of what types of children are served. Younger children are much more likely to be in the home-based centers, although the modal child in our sample is 3. And many daycares close when school is not in session, and that there's a large amount of care that's being done by older siblings, particularly when school is not in session. Another key finding is that providers in this market are heavily female. This is a female-owned and operated industry, which is not actually that uncommon due to the labor market conditions that women face. Again, women tend to need to start their own business due to the lack of wage earning opportunities. We see here that in general, providers in general are relatively highly educated for their communities, and that they tend to have secondary school education or lower. That's about 25% or so of the non-school based, and only about 10% of school based. Many have some sort of completion or degree. But despite their relatively high levels of education, in general, there's a lack of training specific to the child care market and the specific needs of children that would be in their care. About 70% of school-based providers have ever received any sort of training. And that definition is very broad based, ever being trained, as compared to only 20% of home-based providers have ever received any sort of training that's specific to early child care. So this indicates that there's substantial gaps in training, and that a program that could train and empower providers may be highly beneficial. Our second result is that the price of childcare is high for families. So we think about specifically income earned by mothers, and at baseline, a mother's earnings income from paid work is about 15.8 per week on average, while those paying for childcare spend about $4.04 per weekly, meaning 28% of their weekly income. This roughly tracks the data that we're seeing from the firm survey, in that this is about $16 to $18 per week. Notice that the home-based providers in general are a little bit more expensive on a standardized basis than school-based providers. One other note of context is that in the US, a high cost of childcare would be considered 7% of a family's income, and this is substantially more expensive. The third is that daycare quality is variable in this context, but in general, the quality of daycares is quite low. Many daycares lack infrastructure, which is consistent with the broader environment that the daycares are operating in. So, for example, schools actually have worse amenities, possibly because in their homes, the home-based providers tend to want to have more amenities for themselves as well. But just about half of school-based daycares have electricity. It's about 80% of non-school-based have electricity. About 50% of school-based daycares have light fixtures. About a little less than 80% of non-school-based have light fixtures. There's very little ventilation, however. About 5% of either type of provider has any sort of fan to circulate air. And then remember, these are very dense urban communities. But there's also key amenities that are lacking that would be important for a daycare and a daycare, thinking of daycare as early childhood education in particular. So for this age group, toys are very important. And as Mr. Rogers says, uh, uh, play is the work of childhood. And if you ask providers about how whether or not they have any toys, about 44% of daycares have any toys at all. That definition of toys would include low cost materials such as use yogurt cups or empty bottles or bottle caps that one could use as a low cost material to use as a teaching and learning material. Generally, daycares, even if they have amenities, lack any sort of educational content. Um, and this rendered a little bit too big, but in general, if you look at childcare experiences, provider interactions also vary a lot. Even though schools generally have worse amenities than home-based providers, in general, schools are very likely to sing with the children. They're much more likely, about 90% of daycares are um, uh, read to the children, and they report about 90% keep a schedule. About 40% of any daycare, though, actually uh, has the schedule posted. You'll notice that the lack of toys and similarly lack of books is also evident in that many providers never read to the children during their time in the care. And similarly, many daycares are simply lacking any sort of activity for the children other than what we may call unrestricted free play in the environment while they're there. Again, referring to and reflecting the context of the study, child hunger is extremely common. So approximately 19% of daycares have children that go hungry throughout the day. And that is a very um, low, should be thought of as a lower bound. And the actual rate of hunger across all the daycares would be much higher. So approximately 20% of daycares have at least one child that goes 6 to 8 hours without eating anything. Part of this is because only 64% of providers provide lunch. Lunch is relatively expensive for providers to provide. Porridge is in the morning, or uji, as it is known, is about 52% of providers provide porridge. And so there are substantial gaps in what providers provide, and 31% of providers provide no food. Now, food provision matters a lot to parents. If you ask parents, food provision is actually one of the factors that they consider most important for children when they're at school. Um, we're still analyzing that data, but that is definitely the case. But it should be noted that in this environment, especially without electricity, that packing lunch is not common because there's little cold food storage. It's kind of a practicality, logistical constraint. Similarly, the typical Kenyan would not eat something like sandwiches or something that is shelf stable. Most meals are consumed and created for that particular meal, and saving food for the next day would similarly be uncommon because most people don't have a refrigerator, and nonetheless extra food from the previous night's dinner. So food provision is a real ongoing challenge in this sort of environment. Now, I do want to highlight that food is a complicated concept because people may share food, for example. Um, People may also give sort of some of their own food. Typically, the providers eat. So they may share some food, but in general, you should think that this is something that's relatively concerning. And we think about child development. Um, and so we see here that many children arrive without food and in this environment. If you look at what parents say, daycare use is extremely common. And this is consistent with other work on the care networks and care demands of mothers in sub-Saharan Africa, is that child swapping is not a primary strategy that most women use. Partly that's because when everybody is in poverty, it's actually hard to help others. And there is a fair amount of communal support, but in general, people who need to make a living for themselves would have a challenging time taking care of extra children several days a week, especially if they have their own children. And it's important to note also that 41% of moms work in our sample. Daycare is not only for working mothers. Many women, for example, may want daycare so they can go out and search for work further away from their home. It should be noted that unemployment is also a key factor here. In informal settlements, the unemployment rate may be as high as 50%, meaning that the 50% of people who are seeking work can't find it. And that's consistent with relatively high poverty rates. According to the PPI in our study, about 21% of our sample households are in poverty. If you use a slightly more generous measure, which is the Kenyan poverty line, that's 72%. So it kind of depends upon how you're measuring poverty, but this is a really disadvantaged context. It should be noted, though, that because parents are typically trying to save money, again, because daycare is relatively expensive, there's a substantial churn over time. So what I have here on the x-axis is what we found when we did our survey in earlier this year in Q1. The baseline was summer last year. So you see that over the course of about 6 to 8 months, many people have changed their child care arrangement. So the way to read this is that of parents in daycare, about 65% still had their child in daycare, which is the most common source. So daycare is relatively stable. On the other hand, if at baseline you had a friend watching the kid, now 47% of parents at baseline who had their friend watch their child, 47% are now in daycare. Similarly, if you look at those who were in daycare at baseline, about 17% have dropped out of daycare and now have their child watched by a friend. 9% of people have sent their child to school. Sometimes they go to school earlier. However, again, parents are constantly juggling because they need to also raise money. So juggling unpaid sort of care networks is also very common in this context. So about 50% of women in our sample have relied upon another adult caregiver, typically a grandmother, um, in to watch their children while they are doing something else. 30% have a friend that have watched. Siblings are another very common source, about 28%. And it's important to note that women are typically pursuing multiple strategies for unpaid care at any given time, again, because they have a lot to do and it is difficult to do things with small children. And the network of unpaid care providers is very important. It's important to note, though, that there are going to be gaps. So in our study, we have 9% of children are reported under the age of 4 are reported to have been left unattended for at least 1 hour in the past month. We ask about also some other measures of well-being. So income and daycare is not the only measure of well-being, but we also ask about the depression and mental health of particularly the mothers. So if you look at responses to a standard CES 10 questionnaire, we find about 14% of moms would meet the criteria for clinical depression. And this would be actually in line with existing research and actually even results from the US. The average is approximately the same. If you look at also what factors correlate with mental health, one of the major predictors is actually people reporting that their childcare quality is, as they see it, below average. People who believe that their children um, are being cared for in a suboptimal way typically report higher rates of mental distress. And I think that this highlights is that children are, for young parents, children's well-being is really at the forefront of how their welfare can be measured, and that what happens with children's typically also is very important to adults. Um, and that's about a pretty large percent. That's about 22%. 1 out of 5 parents are displeased with their current childcare arrangement. So, in conclusion, we have a little bit of time for questions. Parents with young children typically need to balance work and childcare. Paid childcare is a promising solution worldwide and may have triple benefits, may have benefits for both children, parents, providers, possibly even wider communities. In urban areas, daycare is widely available, although relatively expensive. And the quality is generally uneven, but overall pretty low. And together, the quality or value may explain part of the unmet need, despite the fact that there are ample places for people to seek care. This matters more directly because poor quality childcare is associated with worse mental health and higher rates of depression. And we're going to continue to explore our rich data to fully capture how daycare affects female empowerment and are actively working on this. So I'm going to pause there and let people ask questions or follow up with any additional questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. That was great. I guess one thing I got out of that, well, I got a lot out of that, but the one thing I got was the amazing attention to detail and the ability to collect data. I think it's probably a difficult place to collect data and the use of that data to provide information. I feel like, so many times we address questions and we just don't have enough information. But here you've got some great information that can help start to answer some really important questions. And so I was really, really amazed by that and amazed at the amount of effort it must have taken to get that actually accomplished, the survey that large. How many total observations did you guys have?
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit of additional background even. So we basically started discussing the study and trying to gain support and funding for it uh, back in 2023 is when the preliminary conversations started. We did a pilot in 2024, and then our first baseline was actually 2025. So we are 2024, I should say, and now we are in 2025. So it's been already almost 2 years of work. We have a very large study. So we have data points from 11 different counties, which is the equivalent of state in Kenya. We have 51 different communities, meaning areas of that are urban informal settlements, which is a pretty large scope. And so our reach is really interesting because it's very broadly reflects a broad geography. We have 978 firms in our baseline study. What we're about to do next is we're going to count the firms again to see if any have opened or closed. Previous work suggests that around 11% of firms close year on year. That's the firm death rate in among micro enterprises, and that there's a large amount of churn. So we're just going to go back and count and figure out how many firms that were there in 2024 are still there in 2025, and also resurvey them about other aspects. Our final study size for the firms is 978, and we're hoping to recontact all of them. On the household size, the actual number of households, which we can generally map to the firms, the households that are in the catchment area, as we would call of the firms, that's nearly 3,000. So that's 2,820. Our midline survey, we have about an 80% response rate. So we have already lost some people as expected. Urban informal settlements are typically a highly mobile population. Um, and I just also want to highlight that, yeah, it is a relatively difficult environment because in communities where people lack generally property rights and are very wary of outsiders, this study has required a lot of careful consideration and trust. And we have worked closely with the key stakeholders in all communities and proceeded to make sure that they are aware and hopefully can benefit from the findings that we have. And that has been partly possible due to the very highly trained staff at IPA Kenya, especially our numerous field enumerators and our RA who is based in Kenya, Doreen Mudaki.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that a lot of us, I mean, who don't do research outside of the US have a good understanding of what it takes to accomplish all of that. It's pretty phenomenal. I mean, you're doing it on another continent. Obviously, you've got partners there who have a lot of local experience and can be on the site, and you got great enumerators, which is great, but that's just a huge amount of effort. And my hat off to you for actually undertaking work like this with your colleagues, of course. I know there's other people involved, but it's really cool to see. So on to some substantive questions. So Stuart Neelis did ask, and this was back when you had your slides, kind of the first couple slides, I think, on the data. And is the teacher-child ratio similar to here? You had the kids in each one, but I guess this is kind of a question of how many teachers are there at the daycare centers with the kids? Is it kind of a similar ratio that we might see here? I'm kind of out of that now, so I don't even know what the ratio would be now. But
Yeah, so I'm still in the thick of it. I have three children myself, and so for home-based daycares in the U.S., the general criteria is you basically need two providers. There's typically a head provider and then an aide. At a home-based daycare, that would be about 10 children. In the US, there's also more specific guidelines regarding the ages of the children. So, for example, the general thought process is that if somebody needed to get out of the building due to a fire, um, you can only have two infants at a time because you need to be able to carry them out. Older children that can walk, it's a lot more nuanced. There's more specific ratios, but in general, it's 10 children and only two infants. Um, in our context, we are seeing ratios that are much larger than that. So what we generally find is on average, in the US, for example, it's about, let's roughly say, ignoring age-specific constraints. In the US, it's about one provider for 5 children. What we're seeing at home daycares is about one provider for 7 children, and at schools are actually much larger. It's about one provider for 11 children, ignoring age-specific issues. Now, as children age up, you don't need as many providers, so any sort of optimal child ratio, you would like to somehow incorporate the age differences. We have actually uh, looked into that a bit, and it's a little complicated because it would be hard to evaluate what would be the optimal ratio in this context, especially as children, especially in home-based daycares, may not be regularly enrolled in the same context. Uh, they may attend for several months and then come back. But in general, one thing that I think is a probably a more clear answer is that there's a few more children, but they're typically in a much smaller space. So even though there's only about two extra children per provider, the physical space that children are being watched in is much smaller. So even if the provider ratio is not as alarming, and it actually can be quite alarming. I think one school has a ratio of about 70 kids for one provider. That's the upper extreme. Um, uh, Children don't have a lot of space to move around, and it can be quite crowded, which is another key consideration of any sort of ratio. That's a great question.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a lot bigger than what we would be used to here in, say, the United States and probably say in Europe or something like that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I wonder if you could disentangle a little bit the what came across, and I guess in one of the slides you pointed out that there's actually is a pretty high supply in some sense. There's a lot of
Mhm.
these sort
Yeah.
of data available. They may be a little understaffed, or I don't know how you want to look at that, understaffed or overstudented. I don't know how to say that, but but on the other hand, there's a reasonably high supply. If we're going to try to sort of make this if there was a policy prescription going forward for, and I know you're just early into this research,
Mhm.
so this might be sort of pushing out there a little further, but what's kind of the policy prescription? Do we need to figure out more ways, or does Kenya need to find more ways to increase supply, or is there somehow, I mean, I don't want to say really increased demand, but
Yeah.
is there a way to sort of figure out a way to loop people into the existing supply a little more effectively? Because I assume there's demand out there, but there's just somehow a way of meeting the demand to the supply that maybe needs to be made more effective. I guess where's the sort of next, what's the big policy sort of conclusion you might recommend from this so far?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different policy recommendations. On the first descriptive fact that you picked up on is there actually are a very large number of daycares, and they operate in a very unclear legal limbo space. So many micro enterprises do not operate in the formal sector. The vast majority, I think if I remember correctly, it's like 70 or 80% of firms are in the informal sector, which means the government does not collect revenues. There's no worker protections. And in this context, that would be similarly like no regulations of daycare providers or what quality that they're giving to children. And again, very young children who may not be able to advocate for themselves. So one thing actually that I know is an ongoing policy debate, and there's very a specific movement and documentation and research working towards is the creation of a childcare license. So that is something that is kind of at the first and forefront is having not just a business license, which does exist, but an actual childcare license. Childcare also in Kenya, education, I should say, in Kenya is also somewhat decentralized. So it's unclear whether or not this license would be at the county level, which is kind of the equivalent of state, or if it would be national. But I think that's one thing that's working that there's active discussions on is okay, we have all of these providers which are providing a very important service for both parents and a vulnerable population, children. Half of our children are under age 3 in our sample. So how can we protect these people in for a very large important industry? And I think that's kind of the first policy concern that exists. That goes in hand, though, with regulations and regular audits that occur here as part of a standard practice in the US. So it's very common, for example, to have registered providers that then check in and have a regular accreditation process. That's how daycare works in the US. And there's potentially criticism that it may be overly prescriptive about what their regulations are, but there are enforced regulations and compliance is basically uniform. What sort of quality conditions would need to be here is a lot more open-ended, and there's been I know similarly work on trying to establish minimum quality standards and making sure that they are also in line with the environment. So for example, one requirement in the US is that all daycares must have electricity and running water. I believe here in Ohio, actually, another criteria is something like a dishwasher. Um, that would not be practical and potentially even necessary to accomplish the key goal of protecting vulnerable children. Only 50% of our schools, for example, have electricity, but people don't need electricity. They can have light. Um, Clean water is another key concern, but you don't necessarily need a tap to do that. And in fact, many people don't get their water from a tap. Um, on the other hand, things like that already came up, like the provider ratio, what that would look like may be important for safety, but also probably more basic is provision of food and actually giving children to do. So I have visited daycares where in Kenya, where children are basically taught to sit quietly for 8 hours with very minimal food, and there's no toys or nothing to do. So I think that would sort of be a part of an equality and policy consideration is uh, teaching providers to use local materials to create toys and also generally encouraging what's called dialogic talk, which is interactions with children where you're basically talking to children and helping children learn in kind of a low cost way. Effort costs, but low cost way is also really important for children's literacy development and their cognition. Many providers, as I understand it, don't think it's helpful or important to talk to babies and may not recognize the benefits of simply engaging with children instead of just letting children or enforcing that children do not talk and stay quiet. That's a very common thing. And I think some of those uh, quality considerations and what appropriate uh, what a minimum standard would look like should be evidence-based, and we're hopefully going to use our data to contribute to that conversation. And we can use our data to do some simulations about how many providers you would possibly kick out of the market if you enforced a quality standard, a given quality standard, keeping in mind that then parents going to that provider would somehow be much worse off if their provider closed.
Yeah, so lots of layers there that sort of trying to sort of, I guess, thread the needle between, creating a set of standards that would improve the outcomes for everybody. But then, of course, that point you just made there right at the end, which is that, well, I mean, if you make them too high and a lot of these close down, then suddenly your people are, many families are missing out on that opportunity, right? Supply declines and prices go up. That's a big issue. So we did have another question, and so this is a person who doesn't need a license, a grandparent, right? So to what extent do grandparents and sort of the other generations in a household sort of play in terms of helping to watch kids in Kenya? Is that an issue?
So I would say it's a very common source of care. So we have up to about 50% of women in our sample report relying upon another adult, typically a grandmother, for sources of unpaid care. If my mother is listening, I would also like to give a shout out to my parents for providing unpaid care to my children. There's a lot to be learned from having intergenerational caregivers, right? To having a variety of people who can be there to support a child's development, and that's very nice. Our focus groups with mothers have actually highlighted, though, that there's serious concerns with relying upon unpaid caregivers regularly for a large amount of time for their children. So again, about 20% of our respondents are in poverty. Poverty is very common, and poverty is first and foremost often accompanied by lack of food and food insecurity. And so what we found in pre-study work is that parents actually were very reluctant to just rely upon relatives because there was concerns about relatives using corporal punishment. There was concerns about relatives not giving children adequate food during the day. And so that's part of the conversation here too, is that maybe also parents don't want to do that. Maybe parents would prefer an environment that is regular, that's structured, that provides education. And many grandparents may not be using educational resources, although there may be other benefits. I'd also kind of highlight that in addition to daycares and home providers not having any toys, homes often don't have books, entertainment, a TV. Radios are relatively more common, but many homes also don't have typical educational content. That could also be a really important aspect of child development. There's been studies that have shown the proliferation of Sesame Street has improved um, the learning of children as it was rolled out back in the 60s. There's a pretty famous paper by Melissa Kearney about that. So children here are kind of missing out on that, and it would be up to a grandparent to not just be a childminder, but to be an educator, which is really where you see the cognitive benefits of paid childcare is when children are actively engaged in learning either through play or some other structured curriculum.
Yeah. So we probably have to leave it there, but that I think is a good point to end on that, that it's actually not just the provision of just any childcare, but it's actually really the quality of it that makes a huge difference to the outcomes down the road. And I think you started out with that point at the beginning, which was really great. And then, sort of brought it home there. So I like that because that's, I think that, to me that just sort of described it. There's two edges of the problem here. One is provision of enough, right? And supply, and the other one is let's manage the quality because that really matters for the outcomes that we want to have happen, right? So really appreciate that. Well, Ann, thanks a lot for joining us on this. It was a super seminar, incredible, a lot of information there, and sort of emblematic of a huge amount of work, which my hat's off to you for doing that work and for presenting that here, but for doing that for society. I think it's really great. And at some point we'll have to talk about, you know, how society can get more of this kind of work going on. So I want to let everyone else know that we do have another webinar, one more in our series this year. It will be coming up in about a few weeks, I think, on June 11th. Brian Murray will talk about navigating the future, clean energy, AI, and grid expansion amid policy shifts. So that's our next one. I look forward to seeing people there. This one will be available to people that you can download it and review it later. So we'll send that link out to all registrants here shortly. So Ann, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, then I hit the recording button to turn it off.